Welcome. Do you think we can change our life by drawing, by painting? As a more general question, I suppose I can ask, can our art change life? Is there a connection between art and life? Can art predict life? But in this video, in this presentation, I just wanted to have a look at drawing that influences reality, or ways of drawing that are believed to influence our reality. And to simplify things, we'll call it magical drawing, right? Draw to change something about the world that we live in, about something that we want to change, whether within ourselves or in the outside world. So let's start the presentation so we can dive in. Okay, so magical drawing. Can drawing change lives? Can drawing change our reality? So what we're going to look into here, and I'll try to make it short and concise, because obviously one can go on many tangents here, and it's it's a never-ending topic. But we're going to look at conceptual and magical drawing. So as I said, drawing that changes lives, changes reality. Can we encode energy, frequency into our drawing? It is, of course, connected to writing and sacred writing. I had a video on that before. Sacred art, such as icons, for example, and images, the use of sculptures and sacred sculptures and so on. Everything is connected to everything else. But so we will focus on what I would call magical drawing, in the sense that, just as you have magical thinking when you're trying to think positive, well, so can you have magical drawing in order to draw something positive, right? To draw in positive changes. Let's simplify it like that. So we will look at mandalas and yantras, sigils, veves, neurographics, and some practical exercises just to exemplify, how it works. So, mandalas and yantras. Well, maybe the important concept would be to begin with a definition of what is what. So when I say the word mandala, what first comes to your mind? I think nowadays, maybe in the past 10, 15 years, mandala has come to be identified with these coloring books for adults, right? Where you can start drawing and coloring mandalas to calm down, or kind of to use it as a form of art therapy. So you have those coloring books, and then you have to fill in spaces, right, with your favorite colors. So you use pencils usually, or markers, and just draw in your grown-up coloring book. And that's the definition of mandala that many have. Now, we also have the traditional mandalas in a religious sense, and we have yantras, and sometimes these are used interchangeably. I suppose at one point I used to think that, well, yantra comes from a Hindu tradition, right? And it's just a Hindu mandala, basically. It's just a word, right? So Buddhists have mandalas and Hindus have yantras. And there are many other definitions, depending on who you're talking to, right? And what angle they have. But the idea is that a yantra is indeed used in Hinduism and in tantric based work. So yantra is a tantric practice, so a kind of unifying practice, and a yantra will always have 4 gates, right? 4 directions or 4 elements in Western alchemy, and a center. So this image here, this is a yantra, for example, right? And yantra would be something that calls on a divinity or an energy, something that evokes, right? That brings up a spirit, for example, a deity. So we have, for example, a Kali yantra. This is the image called to call upon the goddess Kali or the energy of Kali, whichever way you like to define it. So this is a Kali yantra, whereas a mandala would be something that reflects your inner world. So a yantra will have again, here we see, right, the 4 entrances, 4 gateways, 4 directions, and we have a center point. Whereas a mandala represents your inner world, and it is intended to work through your inner world. Whereas yantra draws down specific energies, connects to a particular channel, right? So that's, at least that's the definition that is, considered to be a classic, let's say, in terms of defining the difference between mandalas and yantras. So yantra, to draw down the spirit, to work with the energy of a divinity or of a particular energy center, energy channel, and mandala is a representation of the inner world and also opportunity to work through the inner world. Maybe you want to change your perception. You can't really change the outer world so much, but you can change your perception. You can change something within you, transform your blocks. And for this, there are special techniques of working with mandalas. All right. We will focus on drawing here, but in terms of mandalas, there is also a technique of woven mandalas where you weave them with yarn. And so it's also a meditative process, and some form of, energy is also being encoded into this work. And then, of course, I'm sure you all know the Buddhist mandalas. So here you have a monk working on a mandala. So in this tradition, mandalas are assembled with colored sand. I've actually seen one of them, in the process of being created. It was beautiful, many colors, many different sections. Over many days. I think in that case, it was over 3 days. It was in New Orleans. And then after those 3 days, or maybe hours or a week or whatever it is, then the mandala is destroyed. And that is to represent the impermanence. So there is a lot of work. There's many hours of work put in, but we can't keep it. We can't bring it on together. So we do it and then we let it go. We surrender. That's the nature of life. So that is that Buddhist technique of working with mandalas, one of the techniques. And of course, every symbol and color, it also has specific meaning. It's not just built for destruction, but it uses that language of symbolism. And I think before we go any further, we have to ask ourselves the question, right? Is drawing magical? Is it? I had a video before where we talked about magical letters, right? That letters have the power in themselves, where, for example, you have mezuzot, the mezuzah, like in a Jewish home, there would be a scroll of the sacred writing of the Torah, wrapped and placed inside like an oblong object that you put on a doorpost, a bit slanted. And so it's a sacred text inside an object. The object is put on a doorpost because every time you exit and enter a building, every time you exit and enter a room, you change a state, right? You move from one energy to another. Even in the house, you move, for example, from a kitchen to a bedroom, or from the toilet, you go to a living room. And these spaces have different functions. We can say, yes, everything is holy, but at the same time, nobody sets up dinner in a toilet, right? And probably doesn't sleep in a toilet either. So there are different functions for different realities. And so these doorposts, they signify that, okay, this holy text, it protects, yes, but it also helps me remember. If I touch the doorpost, I remember that I'm changing a state. And I'm sure in many traditions there is something similar. There are runic drawings on the walls. There are like Islamic sacred scrolls placed in the house, or calligraphy also to signify divine presence, etc. So we have, of course, sacred seals or sigils. One of the famous sacred seals is called the Seal of Solomon, which you see in the picture here in gold, right? So that is the seal of Solomon, so attributed to King Solomon, who had a gift, a permission from God to summon jinn and demons and work with spirits for well, among other things, for construction purposes, but he was also very powerful. And the construction purposes, yes, you guessed it, hence the Freemasonry that claims the descent from Solomon, because he was a master builder. But if we spiritualize it, so that's that mandate from God to build, right, to create. But some people will take it very literally and will use the seals, such as in Goetia, there are seals to summon spirits, to summon demons. There's quite a lot of them. We're not going to go into that because that's not really my main area of interest, but it exists. It's there. And they come from Renaissance and medieval manuscripts, right, that use that practice. So to have a spirit do your bidding in whatever undertaking, whatever help you need with. The core of it. So what does the sacred seal? Okay, you have the seal of Solomon. There are some glyphs there, some signs, and we all know the language of signs, right? We have the language of signs and symbols, which is the oldest language in the world. We have tarot cards. We all know that a symbol speaks more powerfully than a word sometimes, right? We all know. We see a sign for a drugstore, for pharmacy, before we see letters for pharmacy. It's the green cross, or in, whatever country has what symbols, but like in the Western Christian world, it's usually a cross, green or red. And so we see it from far away, and we know, oh, that's a pharmacy. And some countries are very fond of road signs. For example, in Scandinavia, you have those like whatever 50 or 100 different road signs. So the directions are not written in letters, they're written in symbols. And then one has to learn them and fail the driving test over and over again. But so it's the language of symbols. Now, the only question is, do these symbols have power beyond just simplifying writing? Do they have a power to bind energy? And for those who work with seals and magical drawing, the answer is a definite yes, because they would believe that the true form, the true meaning of an object is high frequency, is higher vibration. It exists in the world of well, not the unmanifest, but in the world of ideas, in the world of, let's say, true objects. So, for example, you have an ideal apple, very roughly speaking. But when I say apple, what comes to your mind is memory, right? Or a sum total of all the apples you've eaten. And furthermore, if I were to tell you, well, give me a symbol for an apple, maybe the first symbol that comes to mind is actually the computer you're using, right? An Apple or an iPhone. Or maybe later you will draw like a symbolic apple, and that will be something different again. But the basic principle underlying work with symbols is that the true form of an object has a very high frequency. We can't perceive it. So we can only perceive their projections, their reflections. A symbol is a mirror, just as is a picture or a photograph. I don't know if you know, I know several people of various traditions, but most of them are powerful healers and spiritual masters who don't like to be photographed very often, if at all. So you always have to ask for permission to take a photograph. And then there are some people who, just live next door to you who probably don't like being photographed, because in many belief systems, you will find the conviction that the image takes a power away from the object it represents. So if people take too many photographs of you, your power goes into that photograph. It stays there somehow. And probably the most famous literary example of it is the portrait of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, right? So it's a picture. Was the name of the book The Picture of Dorian Gray? I think it was The Picture of Dorian Gray. Anyway, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. So, and in that book, the story goes that a young man has a portrait of him painted, and somehow, miraculously, that image becomes his mirror in a very literal sense. It adopts it takes over the consequences that his behavior produces on his looks, on his expression. Like, if you frown a lot, you get wrinkles here, right? Or if you smile a lot, you get wrinkles here. But they are obviously, we age, our faces change their shape and so on. And so that man, Dorian Gray, he notices that, well, this doesn't happen to him. This happens to his portrait. This happens to an image of him. So he goes and looks at this image as if in a mirror, because that's the only mirror that he has. He doesn't see himself change. He doesn't change. So he becomes more and more emboldened by it. Oh, now I can cheat, steal, lie, murder. I don't have to be nice because it doesn't show in my face. So Oscar Wilde also plays there with, that conviction that, oh, no, true beauty is on the inside. And he says, well, actually, maybe not. Your eyes are a mirror of your soul. How about your face is a mirror of your soul as well? And of course, eventually the portrait, the picture becomes so ugly that Dorian can't stand this mirror anymore. And he decides to cut it. And so he comes at the picture with a knife, he stabs it, and of course the next morning the servants find a portrait of a beautiful young man and an ugly old guy lying on the floor with a knife to his chest. So he tries to stab the mirror, but you can't, right? So he ends up killing himself. And so that's that artistic representation the musings on the power of images. Do they take from us? What do they take? How can we affect our reality through images? We have so there were those sigils, portraits, pictures in the Western tradition. We have in the African tradition and Haitian voodoo, New Orleans voodoo, wherever voodoo religion has been practiced, we have veves, which are not exactly mandalas in the sense that they're not round. They have a particular, shapes, different system. And they belong to that specific tradition. They are used to summon, to call forth, to communicate with spirits in the voodoo religion. So here to the left is Marassa twins. It's the twins who are both children and very ancient souls, the oldest deities in the voodoo pantheon. They are two, and yet they are one, and yet they are three, because out of their union comes the third energy. So very, very fascinating, the Marassa twins. And here to the right, you have a veve for Papa Legba, if I'm not mistaken, the gatekeeper. He's the first one you have to approach when you enter, when you start interacting with deities. So he'd open the gates, right? And you can see that it somehow, again, represents this gate. It's a sort of a gate that you can open or close. And then here in the center, there is a picture of a practitioner, right, invoking those spirits, just with on the pavement, right, with some chalks on the pavement. So let's do an exercise that before I go talking more, or before we go in too deeply, let's just try to practice and see if it really is something that that you can work with, whether whether it makes sense to you personally, in terms of do you feel like you're interested in the subject of influencing your life with drawing? But don't worry, we're not going to do anything complicated. What I'm going to ask you to do, just for experimental purposes, is to get a piece of paper. It doesn't have to be big, or part of a notebook, and a pen or a pencil, whatever else is handy. And I'm going to ask you to draw a spiral, just a simple spiral like the one you see on the screen. It doesn't matter which direction the spiral goes. It doesn't matter how many rings it has. It can be the exact copy of what you see in the screen. On the screen can be something your style, but basically a simple spiral, right? Just something that you draw. Let's just pretend we are drawing a spiral. So like a 3-second spiral. That's it. So now I'm going to share a video with you, just for a few minutes. And as you watch the video, just try and maybe close your eyes, tune into the sound, or have your eyes open and just try to experience it, just feel it. It's the song of the waves. It's the sounds of the waves with the sounds of the ocean. So let me see. Let me just check where we are. Give me a second. So there we go. So just absorb yourself into the sound for a few minutes. So now what I would like you to do is to draw another spiral. Just take the same piece of paper, pen, and just draw another spiral without thinking too much again what it should look like, just a random spiral. And now let's listen to something else. So what I'm going to share now will be another sound, and will be a sound of a black hole. An actual sonification of a sound. So in this sense, the sound, the black holes do indeed make a sound, but it's very, very low. So the real sound of a black hole had to be like raised some astronomical number, like, almost 1,000,000 times higher. I don't even remember those details because it's so low. It's impossibly low for any ear to hear. And so it has been artificially raised so that a human ear can hear it, can hear the sound waves that a black hole emits that come out of there. So I'm going to share the black hole sound. And again, it's only 1 minute. Just listen to it. It's quite a fascinating, exercise. So let me just see. There we go. Okay, so we are going. Okay. What do you feel? So now, before anything changes, before going any further, let's draw a spiral. And now I would like to ask you a question. Are your spirals any different? Is there a difference between the spirals? For example, I can tell you, and this is the second time I'm doing this test, just a completely random test. There was no, serious research involved in why I chose black holes versus whales, just random sounds, very different frequencies, very different imagery. Probably the black hole was, most people say it's not a very pleasant sound, which is understandable because it's still very low, and it's, after all, it's something that sucks everything in. So it's not a high frequency, not something that is pleasant to hear. But I can tell you the difference between my spirals, and this is the second time in a row this happened. So first of all, my first spiral that I drew, just a random spiral, it wasn't very round. It had like a little bit of sharp edges, and it went clockwise, right? So I start at the center, and then I go on the clock. Then the second spiral with the whales, it was much bigger, a little rounder, but very uneven still, kind of maybe more spread out, and now it goes against the clock. And the third spiral after the black hole, for some reason, this is the second time, it's almost a perfectly round. I mean, it's not a perfect circle because it's a spiral, but it's a very, perfectly round shape. again, going anti-clockwise, and kind of as far as the simple spiral goes, it's the most round of the shapes. If there is any difference at all, then it means that somehow those sounds, those frequencies, those impressions, those responses of your body, somehow they influence the way you draw. The big question is, can we encode this energy into our drawing? Meaning, is the sound of a black hole encoded in spiral number 3? And is the song of the whales encoded in spiral number 2? And I believe that at least a part of it, yes, it is encoded in the spiral. And that's the purpose of the magical drawing, right, of doing this. Of course, this is the question that you have to answer for yourself. If you don't believe it, then you don't believe it. But I'll go from the premise that, well, yes, it is possible to encode energy. So we have modality called neurographics that in 2015, I believe, was introduced in Russia by university educator, professor or not, I wouldn't say, Alexander Piskarev in Russia. And it is exactly the modality that teaches you, or rather works with encoding energy in art. But rather than perhaps encoding as such, so drawing something to capture the energy, it works with creating new neural pathways. Now, the technique is using markers. I'm going to talk about ink, the use of ink, pencils, markers, etc. in a moment. But the technique is basically you use markers. You use markers to draw the lines and you use markers to fill in the spaces. The main principle behind this work, neurographics, and why do I even mention it? The main principle is that out of all the creation, only us humans are born with the capacity to assign meaning, to look for meaning. We want to know why this is happening to me. They say, you know, oh, only humans can be creative, only humans can have language, communicate. Well, I mean, even trees can be creative and can come up with creative solutions. And okay, if we define language as reading and writing, then yeah, it's only humans, but all species have some form of language. But assigning meaning, that is probably most likely a quality that is unique to humans, because we want to know why. We want to know why things are happening. We want to know what is the meaning of the ending of this movie. We want to know why do animals die, or do birds have little why do birds reproduce, right? Why are the children born? You know, when a kid is 3 or 5 years old and they keep constantly asking, but why? Oh, because. And but why? So why is it hot? Well, because the sun is shining. But why is the sun shining? Well, because that's its job. And why is its job? So there is that's the practice of the human tendency. But in truth, we are always questioning, why is this happening to me, right? We need to assign meaning, and that's part of our job as humans. We do assign meaning to circumstances, to objects, to situations, to, you know, seeming coincidences and so on. However, this very quality is the root of all our problems, very often at least, in most cases, because we create meaning. We don't just assign it, we create it. So if something happens to you, if your father yells at you because you are dancing. You may have a block. Whenever you start dancing, you may start getting a headache or start feeling sick, or you will not want to leave the house because suddenly dancing is associated with unpleasant circumstances, right? Or which it is not. It's not related, but our brain assigns meaning. And there is a myriad examples. So the principle of neurographics is that, yes, we can draw absolutely everything, and we can change the patterns of our brain through changing the patterns that we draw. And that solutions to problems, because problems are created in the rational mind, the part of the mind that assigns meaning. So our job is not to rewrite that meaning and re-mean the meaning and understand, yes, it's possible we can understand, but then it's best for us to assign our own meaning. But true solutions will not come through the rational mind that assigned those meanings in the first place. So you can't really reassign them since they are assigned, but solutions will come at the core, will come at the subconscious level, the level where you can rewire the brain through imitating its structure, through drawing a neurographic line. And the neurographic line is this line that goes, so it's never a straight line, it goes like a wave, right? If you've seen brain waves, it's exactly that. That line is meant to imitate brain waves. So the images here are part of an exercise called the neurographic tree, where you draw a tree, but with these patterns. So you draw it from root to the crown. Then wherever your lines intersect, see those spaces where lines intersect, you first of all, not sharpen, but you round sharp edges. So wherever those line intersections create sharp edges, right? There is, like, for example, where lines intersect here, there's sharpness. So you round them, you remove that sharpness from everywhere. You can thicken the lines, make them thicker, and especially at the root. But basically, so you want to round up the shapes, and then you can add leaves or triangles or squares to the tree to imitate fruit, for example, because let's say your tree doesn't have any fruit or leaves. Well, what does it mean? It means you're all in your head, but you are not productive because no fruit comes up. So yes, you have a good brain structure, you have a good mental structure, but it's dry. What they call, dry rationalism. Yeah, you can analyze, you're a very analytical person, but no fruit comes out of your analysis. You have the analysis, but nothing's being published, right? nothing is being achieved. So no leaves on your tree. So you can add leaves, etc. But those intersections of the lines, right, you round them up. You round them. You can join several thin lines into one thick one. You can thicken the lines. And as you do that, in this method, your neural pathways are being restructured. And then you start coloring. You use ordinary markers, aquarelle, watercolor markers, whatever it is. I'll explain why markers. But if you don't have markers, obviously you can use pens and pencils, etc. But this work is done with markers in this case. You pick the colors of your liking, and the only rule with coloring is that you have to join a minimum of 2 sections together, preferably more. And this joins the separate sections of the brain as well. So this rewires neural pathways by joining disparate sections together, by creating unity where there was separation, let's say, in the thoughts. Even disjoint thoughts come together to form new patterns. That's all I'm going to say about neurographics for now, but if you're interested, I'm going to post a link to an intro to neurographic tree on my website if you're interested. It's a free intro lesson on how to draw a tree in this modality, where I'll try to be, the most practical with a separate discussion of theory. But it's a very practical modality, a form of art therapy, but it's also aimed to help you, work through, physically solve the problems through drawing, remove blocks, solve problems, attract new people, new money, new jobs, and so on. And many people claim it works. Nothing works for everyone. So it's just a matter of practicing and seeing what works for you and what doesn't. Okay. So that was neurographics, creative art, right? You just draw a line, then you add symbolic leaves and fruits, and you fill in the color, and that restructures your brain. Wonderful activity. You're in the state of flow. Sigils is something entirely different. Sigil is a highly structured, magical drawing. First sigils were, I think, in Western practice, I mentioned veves, they're kind of voodoo sigils, but they belong to a different religion, different culture. Now, in the Western practice, I think the first sigils, they came through these Renaissance occultists, those seals of Solomon that we talked about earlier, this is those sigils or seals of demons. So they used symbols. A sigil would invoke the elements, would invoke the energetics, somehow bind or amplify the energetics of either what we want to bring in or what we want to affect. Sigils drawing a sigil is a highly structured work. A sigil has a structure, it has a principle. You don't just draw a neurographic line however you want and then start interpreting it. No. Here you already have an interpretation. What do you want to achieve? And then based on that, you draw a sigil. And in some traditions, it would mean drawing it at a specific hour. So astrological hour, for example, the hour of the sun, right? If you want to have the sun energy, the day of the sun, or in alignment with a particular planet, like if it's a love spell. So let's make it on Friday, the hour of Venus. Let's gather specific herbs, use ink of a color that is most beneficent, and these are usually prescribed. We have two types of sigils, or let's say we can divide sigils into two types. The yin sigils, whereby something is taken out of an object, so it would be carving, burning onto a wooden disc. So we take some substance out of an object. So here in the picture below, you have an example of a yin sigil. I believe it's in Wiccan practice, right? So it's burnt onto wood. So something is taken out of a wood. And then, of course, we have yang sigils, where you draw on a paper or parchment, or again, you can draw on a wood block or stone, but it adds something to an object. So an ink, right, adds to the paper. So now there's more than just paper. You have paper plus ink, so it adds energy to the object. Here in the drawing above, so we have this sigil, which is called the Talisman of 7 Sacred Seals. It comes from Richard Rudd's work, the Gene Keys and the 7 Sacred Seals. It uses symbols for the archangels taken from these Renaissance alchemical works that, and you may recognize some of these symbols. However, it is called a talisman of 7 sacred seals. Why? Well, not everybody uses the word sigil. So it really depends on the context and on the frame. In Western language or practice, people usually talk about sigils when they're practicing magic with a CK, and the occult. So then or Wicca, right? So then we talk about making sigils. Not everybody wants to be associated with magic and the occult. And wants to have, for various reasons. For example, some people would hear a word sigil and assume that, oh, so you are invoking demons in your free time, right? So not everybody is interested in invoking demons in their free time. So in many cases, people prefer to call these structures, which are actually like this, of the 7 sacred seals, it is a classical sigil based on the principles of magic, of sigil magic, but people would prefer to call it a talisman, because Richard Rudd's work is a contemplative work. It's about connecting to the divine energies, to higher energies, about transforming, transmuting, connecting to your inner heart. It's a very profoundly, deeply contemplative work. So it's really, there's definitely nothing there that would, warrant some associations with the occult. And so people would call then talisman or mandala in other contexts. So as I said, such as in the 7 sacred seals. So that's where those definitions, for example, in my work, I would also call it working with mandalas or creating talismans. And maybe talisman is the safest word to use, because then, it doesn't have previous associations. So sometimes we have to use our language in a particular way to be sure we'll be the least misinterpreted. That's the issue of language. And the power of it. Right, so then what is magical drawing all about? How do we encode energy? How does encoding energy work? So if we were to say, okay, so our spiral, so this spiral number 3, somehow it has the codes of a black hole in Perseus galaxy. Even if it's a simple spiral, but so there's something in it. If I put my, say, left hand on the spiral, if I tune in, so something in me will still hear that sound of a black hole. It will get that same feeling, that same resonance. Maybe it was unpleasant to the ears, but it's also the birth canal of my soul, right? So there will be something. So how do we encode energy? That's assuming we believe we can encode energy. I'll continue on this premise. First of all, ink and materials, right? Well, first of all, we need paper, maybe canvas. The main principle, you want to capture as much energy as possible, right? Kind of. So how do you do that? You would think that, okay, so let's do the Dorian Gray thing, right? Let's have oil colors. They dry very, it's a long time, right? It's a week or so, maybe even several weeks. So that drying time is very long, so we can capture as much energy as possible. So we just, we have the picture of Dorian Gray, and then we have, we just wait for it to absorb all our energy. Wonderful, we figured it out. So I'm just going to play the whale track and have an oil painting drawn to it. Yes, but what if you want to capture the energy of peace? You want to draw a mandala, or you want your painting to capture the energy of peace, or you want your neurographic tree to capture the energy of peace, and decide, no, I'm not going to do it with markers. I'm going to do it with oil and brushes properly. and it takes it 1 week to dry. Are you going to paint for 1 week consecutively? I'd assume at the very minimum you will need some hours to sleep, to eat, maybe to go out of the house to buy groceries. So in this time, what if you leave that painting to dry somewhere over a few days and people will be constantly arguing there? Will that painting then not absorb the energy of argument rather than the energy of peace? So we want to strike kind of that, a good center point where, yes, we have to have some alchemical interaction between the material that we draw on and the materials that we draw with. We want to add something to the paper, and we want to allow the energy kind of to be caught in this process, but we don't want it to be going on for an uncontrollably long time, because if it dries over for a week, then we really can't control what energies come into this drawing, even if it's a mandala or sigil created, by all through all art forms that we know. Even then, we can't control what other energies will interfere. Maybe someone will come in and start arguing, yelling, or someone will be very depressed, and we want to capture joy, but we'll have depressed people coming in and sitting by that painting for the whole week while it's drying. So how much joy will the painting be able to capture? So the ideal materials for drawing of sigils, mandalas, and talismans, which, for the purpose of this presentation, are often the same thing, just called differently. As I explained before, why we may have different names, is in this drawing, right? It's ink on paper. Now, of course, you can draw with pencil or chalk. Maybe you drew your spiral with a pencil or a chalk. It would be the least effective way to capture the energy, to encode the energy onto paper, because, first of all, the structure of a pencil, how does the drawing happen, right? The structure of a pencil, of this graphite, it breaks down and remains on paper. So we draw by breaking off the pieces of a pencil. And the same with the chalk. Remember that picture of a voodoo practitioner drawing veve with a chalk? It's great for the immediate purpose of a ceremony. And the purpose was not to capture the spirit on a pavement, right, in a drawing. It's for the ceremony, and then it's released. So there, the drawing is the process. So sometimes when you're only interested in drawing it out or practicing, like, for example, with neurographics, right, they draw with markers. My first practices, I just drew with what I had, with pencils. But remembering that it is an object, and the interaction of pencil and paper captures the least energy, because simply the tip of the pencil, right, it breaks against the paper, and that what's left gives the color, but it doesn't really capture, it doesn't interact with the paper alchemically, but it can still be used. Markers, they contain alcohol-based ink, very good for big surfaces. So, for example, in neurographics, you would need to check the drying time and quality, so you don't want very cheap markers or bright markers that will bleed through, on your table. And also, like, something that's just simply not convenient to draw with. So you'd want a medium drying time. You'd want some penetration into paper to capture that energy. But in general, in neurographic pictures are not used as mandalas per se, not something to encode the energy in. It's more that very process of drawing that is interesting, because it is when you draw that your brain works. So theoretically speaking, you can also use chalks, for example, or pencils, but to stay in that line, in that egregore, it's always good to follow the rules of the tradition that taught you the work. So red markers I use traditionally. For sigils, for your own talismans, for your own mandalas, yes, markers are better than pencils. If you were to paint a sacred painting, encode the energy of something, maybe listen to the whale song and encode an energy, just a random mandala that you drew out of your inspiration. Well, again, based on this principle, acrylic is better than oil. Here I'm just going to talk about it theoretically, so I'm not going to teach you the principles of drawing and sigil encoding. Although, if you are interested, you can have a look at, you can just Google sigil engine and sigil generator online, see what comes up, check out what comes through. Sigil engine, I believe, just creates kind of it's a fun electronic online project, but it creates sigils based on your intention. Anyway, so encoding energy, you can also draw your talismans, sigils, mandalas with a gel pen or an ink pen. Ink is, of course, perfect in all those old descriptions you'd have. Yes, on the hour of Saturn, right, take red ink and make following markers. So the interaction of ink and paper, it creates this perfect alchemical blend where ink penetrates into paper, and during the time of its drying, of its penetration, it also captures the energy, the intention of a particular hour, of a particular moon alignment, of the position, the intention, the invocation, the prayer, and so on. Now, mandalas, sigils, we can also have them on a computer, right? And print them out, for example. Yes, that's possible. That's beyond the subject of encoding energy, but yes, it's possible. They're basically the same principles apply. Weaving, here the energy would be encoded in the process, right? You can cross stitch and so on, but then that's a different discussion. Of course, energy gets encoded into objects. I would say, like the topic maybe that I'm the most interested in is the interaction of, the medium of drawing, pen and paper, right? The ink and the canvas and so on. Okay, so that was the theory on magical drawing, on creating sigils. Ultimately, it's up to you to answer. Do you believe art can affect reality? Do you believe sigils, magical drawings, talismans, mandalas, yantras can affect reality? Have you meditated with a yantra? If you want to connect to Kali, can you look at the Kali yantra? Will it change your perception? And can a symbol drawn on paper change your life, your relationships, your work? Well, I guess eventually, that's something we need to find out for ourselves. I do believe it's possible to change life with drawing. Depending on the method, it can be very structured or it can be creative, but of course it has to be intentional and it does have to follow certain principles. Simply painting can be very liberating, very activating for your right brain, but it can get things out of you, but maybe it won't be magical painting in the sense that it won't give you the desired effect, right? If you want to be rich, painting doesn't make you richer, or it might, but there is no direct correlation. So if you want to make money, well, then you can work with money attracting sigils or talismans, but then it has to be a structured work. So take a look at the links in the video description, and take a look at my website, also healing-radiance.com, for any other information or materials that you may be interested in. And until next time, I wish you all the best and many blessings, and definitely, even without any complicated lessons or classes on, sigil drawing and template. What was the word? Talisman making. Of course, just remember the magic of, really everything we create, where we put our intention into making an object, into carving an image. All of those stories about a man falling in love with a statue he made, right? And he asks goddess Aphrodite to bring him to life. Well, that also reflects that belief in the immense power that we have as human beings. Our creativity is not just drawing or painting or writing, it's actually creating our life and creating our reality. So with that, I'm going to say thank you and wish you many blessings, and until we meet again.